Pack your tools, Mr. Walker. You're done here. Richard Caldwell's voice cut through the marble foyer of Harrington Estate with the clean, practiced sharpness of a man who had spent years making other people feel small without ever raising his voice. Ethan Walker stood beside an open toolbox, one hand resting on the worn wooden handle of his hammer, while his 9-year-old daughter Sophie waited near the staircase with her backpack pressed against her chest. The restoration isn't finished, Ethan said. It is now. Richard adjusted the cuff of his tailored jacket. You were hired to repair a mansion, not become part of the family. The rain whispered against 30-foot windows, silver streaks sliding down the glass while nearly 24 dinner guests sat frozen beyond the arched doorway. Ethan did not argue. He did not defend himself. He simply looked toward Claire Harrington, the woman who owned the house, the company, and enough property across New England to make rooms like this feel ordinary. Claire stood near the fireplace in a midnight blue dress, perfectly still, her face unreadable. She said nothing. And somehow, that silence hurt more than Richard's words. Ethan lowered his eyes, closed the toolbox, and reached for Sophie's hand. Come on, kiddo. Sophie looked back at Claire. Claire looked back at Sophie. Neither spoke. Then Ethan walked toward the front doors, carrying everything he had brought into that mansion except the warmth he had somehow left behind. 3 weeks earlier, Claire Harrington had hired Ethan Walker because a storm had damaged the east wing of her century-old estate outside Boston. She needed a contractor. Nothing more. She had interviewed 4 firms before him, men with polished portfolios, company trucks, and estimates printed on expensive paper. Ethan arrived in a faded Ford F-150 with a dent near the rear bumper, work boots dusted with sawdust, and a pencil tucked behind one ear. He spent 40 minutes examining beams, window frames, plaster, and original oak flooring before Claire finally lost patience. Can you fix it or not? Ethan ran his thumb along a cracked section of wood. Yeah. How long? Depends how much you want saved. Claire folded her arms. I want it done. Ethan glanced at her. That's not what I asked. That was the first moment she truly noticed him. Not because he was handsome, though there was something steady in his weathered face and quiet grey-blue eyes, but because he did not seem impressed by her name. Everyone knew Harrington Development Group. Everyone knew Claire. Ethan seemed more interested in a damaged floorboard. Before this story goes any further, if you believe dignity still matters, kindness still matters, and second chances can begin in the most unexpected places, take a quiet second to subscribe to the channel and stay with us, because what happened inside this house would change 3 lives forever. Claire pointed toward a section of warped flooring. Replace all of it. Ethan crouched, studying the grain. No. Her eyebrows lifted. Excuse me. This oak is probably 80 years old. Most of it can be restored. I'm paying for new flooring. Ethan stood slowly. You're paying me to know when new isn't better. The room went quiet. Claire Harrington was accustomed to obedience. Ethan Walker offered something else. Respect without fear. Confidence without arrogance. She should have dismissed him. Instead, after a long pause, she said, "When can you start?" Ethan looked toward the long hallway leading into the east wing, where one locked door waited beneath a darkened brass light fixture. Monday. Neither of them knew it yet, but behind that door was the reason Claire had stopped calling this mansion home, and Ethan was about to uncover far more than damaged wood. Monday morning arrived under a pale New England sky, and by 7:15 Ethan Walker was already unloading lumber, drop cloths, hand tools, and 2 battered thermoses from the back of his Ford F-150. Harrington Estate looked different without evening rain pressing against the windows. In daylight, the mansion was almost too perfect from a distance, with white stone columns, slate roofs, and tall maples turning gold along the drive, but Ethan noticed what photographs would never show. Hairline cracks around the eastern windows. Water stains beneath copper gutters. Soft spots under the porch trim. A house could wear wealth the way a person wore a tailored suit, but age always told the truth eventually. Margaret Hale opened the side entrance before he knocked. She wore a grey cardigan, sensible shoes, and the patient expression of someone who had spent years watching important people rush through rooms without really seeing them. "Mr. Walker," she asked. "Ethan is fine. I am Margaret." Miss Harrington said you would be here early. Ethan glanced at his watch. I said 7:30. Margaret smiled faintly. Around here, that counts as early. Inside, the mansion smelled of polished wood, coffee, and the faint mineral scent of old stone. Ethan laid down canvas runners before bringing in his tools. He was measuring a damaged baseboard when Claire entered the hall speaking into her phone. No, move the Chicago call to 11. Tell legal I want the revised language before noon. And somebody needs to explain why a $6 million variance appeared after the board packet was finalized. She ended the call and looked at Ethan. You started already. That was the arrangement. Most contractors wait for someone to show them where to begin. Ethan marked a measurement with his pencil. Most houses do not. Claire watched him for a second, unsure whether he was joking. The east wing needs to be usable by the end of the month. Usable and restored are different things. I need both. Then I need time. She exhaled. How much? Ethan looked up. Time, Miss Harrington. Not money. That answer seemed to bother her more than a higher estimate would have. By 9:30, the quiet rhythm of work had settled into the house. The soft scrape of sandpaper. The click of a tape measure. The low hum of a vacuum drawing dust from beneath old trim. Claire passed through twice, both times on conference calls, both times slowing almost imperceptibly near the doorway. At noon she found Ethan sitting on the back steps with half a turkey sandwich and a paper cup of coffee. There is a full kitchen inside, she said. I know. Margaret could make you lunch. I brought lunch. Claire glanced toward the gardens. You are difficult to accommodate. Ethan smiled slightly. I am pretty easy to accommodate. People just keep offering things I did not ask for. Her phone buzzed. She ignored it for 3 seconds longer than usual. You always leave at 5. 5 sharp. I can pay overtime. I pick up my daughter at 5:30. Someone else cannot do that. Ethan's expression did not change, but something in his voice settled deeper. Someone else is not her dad. Claire looked away first. Of course. At 4:48, Ethan was cleaning his workspace when a faint drop of water struck the hardwood near the far end of the hallway. Then another. Then another. He followed the sound to the locked door beneath the brass light fixture. A thin dark line of moisture had appeared along the frame. Ethan crouched and touched the floor. Wet. Claire's voice came from behind him. Do not open that door. He stood slowly. There is water getting in behind this wall. Then fix it from this side. That may not be possible. Make it possible. Ethan studied her face. The confidence was still there, but something else had entered her eyes now, something quieter and far older than authority. He nodded once. All right. Claire seemed surprised that he did not argue. Ethan picked up his flashlight, then paused beside the door. But water does not care what room you are afraid to enter. For the first time all day, Claire Harrington had no answer. The next morning, Ethan returned before sunrise and found the mansion unusually quiet. No conference calls echoed through the halls. No heels crossed the marble floor. Only the old house seemed awake, settling around him with soft wooden creaks as pale light slipped through the eastern windows. He worked for nearly 2 hours before Margaret appeared with coffee and a look that suggested she had already noticed the change. Miss Harrington left early for the city, she said. Board meeting. Ethan nodded. Good. Maybe I can get some actual work done. Margaret almost smiled. Careful. She might hear you from Boston. By 10, Ethan had removed 2 damaged sections of trim, reinforced a warped window frame, and traced the moisture line farther down the hallway. It still led back to the locked room. He did not touch the door. Claire had made that boundary clear, and Ethan believed respect mattered most when no one was watching. Then his phone rang. He glanced at the screen and answered immediately. Hey, Mrs. Donnelly. He listened, his expression changing. No, that is okay. I understand. Another pause. I will figure it out. He ended the call and stood still for a moment. Margaret looked over from the doorway. Problem. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. Sophie's after-school program closed early. Heating issue. Bring her here. Ethan looked at Margaret. I do not think your boss would love that. My boss is in Boston. That is not exactly permission. Margaret lifted one eyebrow. Then consider it an emergency preservation measure. 40 minutes later, Sophie Walker walked through the side entrance wearing a red backpack, yellow sneakers, and an expression of wonder so open that the mansion seemed different simply because she was looking at it. Whoa, she whispered. Ethan took her coat. Indoor voice. That was my indoor voice. Margaret laughed before she could stop herself. Sophie spent the first hour at a small table near Ethan's work area, drawing houses while he sanded damaged oak. She asked questions about everything. Why were the ceilings so high? Why did the windows have little waves in the glass? Why did rich people need so many rooms? Ethan answered what he could and ignored what he could not. Around 3:30, Claire returned. The front doors opened. Her heels crossed the foyer. Then stopped. Sophie was standing beneath a portrait near the staircase, studying it with her hands behind her back. Claire looked from the child to Ethan. We have a visitor. Ethan set down his sanding block. Her program closed early. I can leave if this is a problem. Sophie turned. Hi. I am Sophie. Claire hesitated, then said, Claire. Sophie looked around the enormous foyer. Do you live here? Claire blinked. Yes. All by yourself. Ethan glanced over. Sophie. What? I am just asking. Claire surprised them both by answering. Mostly. Sophie considered that, then pointed toward the West Hall. Which room is your favorite? Claire opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Sophie waited. Ethan kept working, but slower now. Finally Claire said, I do not really have one. Sophie frowned with the seriousness only a child could manage. That is weird. Sophie. Dad, if you have this many rooms, you should like at least one. Claire looked toward the long hallway, toward the locked door at the very end. Her face changed for only a second, but Ethan saw it. Sophie did too. Later, while Ethan packed his tools, he found a drawing on the workbench. Sophie had sketched the mansion beneath a bright blue sky. 3 small figures stood on the front steps. One was Ethan. One was Sophie. The third had long brown hair and stood beside them. Claire had come up quietly behind him. She draws quickly, she said. Ethan handed her the page. Claire stared at it for a long moment. Children imagine things. Sometimes. Ethan closed his toolbox. Sometimes they notice things adults work very hard not to. Claire looked again at the 3 figures. Down the hallway, a single drop of water struck the floor beside the locked door. This time, Claire heard it too. The next afternoon, Sophie returned with Ethan because the heating problem at her school had not been fixed, and this time Claire did not object. She only looked at the red backpack by the side entrance, then at Ethan, and said, she knows the library is off limits. Claire folded her arms, but there was amusement in her eyes now. What would be a normal time? Sophie considered this carefully. Before the food gets cold. Claire laughed softly. It was not the polished laugh Ethan had heard her use on business calls. This one surprised her. Margaret, standing near the dining room doors, froze for half a second. She had not heard that sound in years. The following day, Claire came home at 4:30. She offered no explanation. She simply placed her phone face down on the kitchen counter and asked Margaret what was for dinner. Ethan was repairing a loose window latch nearby when Sophie leaned toward him and whispered, "See." Ethan kept his eyes on the screwdriver. "See what?" Sophie smiled. "She is learning how to live here." Ethan looked toward Claire. She was standing in the late afternoon light, sleeves rolled slightly above her wrists, listening as Margaret explained an old family recipe. For once, Claire did not look like the owner of Harrington Estate. She looked like someone trying to remember how to belong inside it. Then a gust of wind moved through the east hall, and from somewhere near the locked room came a soft metallic sound. Ethan turned. A brass key lay on the floor beneath the door. The brass key lay on the hardwood as if the house itself had finally decided to speak. Ethan stared at it for a moment, then bent down and picked it up. It was old, heavier than it looked, with a small engraved letter H worn smooth near the bow. He did not put it into the lock. He did not even step closer to the door. Instead, he carried it back toward the kitchen, where Claire was standing beside Margaret with a dish towel in one hand and an expression that suggested she still had not decided whether helping with dinner counted as work. "This fell outside the east room," Ethan said. Claire looked at the key, and all the warmth left her face. Margaret went quiet. Sophie noticed first. Children often did. "Is that the room you do not like?" she asked. Claire set the towel down. "Sophie, some rooms are private." "I know." Sophie lowered her voice. "I have things I do not like talking about too." Claire looked at her, surprised by the simple grace of the answer. Ethan placed the key on the counter. "I did not use it." Claire's eyes moved to his. "You could have." "That is why I did not." For several seconds, nobody spoke. Then thunder rolled somewhere beyond the hills. The storm arrived after midnight. By 2 a.m, rain was hammering the slate roof and running in silver sheets across the tall windows. Ethan was not there when Margaret called him. He answered on the second ring. "The east hallway is taking water," she said. 25 minutes later, his truck pulled beneath the covered drive. Claire was waiting inside in jeans, an old sweatshirt, and rain boots, looking less like the head of a billion-dollar company than Ethan had ever seen her. Water had already spread 6 feet across the hallway floor. He set down his equipment and followed the moisture line toward the locked door. "It is coming from inside that wall," he said. "Can you stop it without opening the room?" Claire asked. Ethan looked at the ceiling, then at the water darkening the trim. "Not anymore." Claire closed her eyes. Rain drummed against the windows. Somewhere in the house, an old clock struck 3. Ethan waited. He did not reach for the key. He did not tell her what she had to do. At last, Claire walked to the kitchen, returned with the brass key, and stood before the door. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed it into the lock. The mechanism turned with a dull click. The door opened. The room beyond smelled of cedar, dust, and old paper. It was not a bedroom. It was a workshop. A wooden drafting table stood beneath a covered window. Shelves held hand planes, clamps, carpenter squares, and jars filled with worn brass screws. Rolled architectural drawings rested in one corner. Against the far wall hung a faded photograph of a younger man in work clothes, smiling beside the unfinished frame of Harrington Estate. Ethan stepped inside only after Claire did. "Your father?" he asked softly. Claire nodded. "Before the company. Before the money. He built houses." Ethan's gaze moved over the tools. "With his hands. He hated when people forgot that." Claire crossed the room and touched a wooden ruler resting on the drafting table. Burned into the edge were the words Thomas Harrington, carpenter. "After he died, I locked this room," she said. "Why?" Ethan asked. Claire stared at the ruler. "Because everything he built reminded me of what I was trying to become." Ethan said nothing. She continued, quieter now. "I spent years making sure nobody looked at me and saw the contractor's daughter. I wanted them to see the university degree, the company, the boardroom, the buildings with my name on them." Ethan looked around the workshop. "And did it work?" Claire gave a small, tired laugh. "Too well." A gust of rain struck the windows, and water dripped from a cracked section of plaster near the ceiling. Ethan pulled a top from his bag and moved beneath it. "We can save this room." Claire looked at him. "You are sure?" He picked up her father's wooden ruler, turning it carefully in his hands before returning it to the table. "Good wood is worth saving." Claire remembered the first day they met. The same words, almost. Only now she understood that Ethan had never been talking only about floors. By sunrise, the storm had moved east, leaving the ground silver with rain and the maples trembling under a clean October sky. Ethan had stayed until nearly 5 a.m. to protect the workshop from further water damage, and when he returned later that afternoon, he expected Claire to be buried in meetings again. Instead, he found her standing in her father's workshop wearing old jeans, a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and a pair of work gloves that looked as though they had been purchased that morning. "You are early," Ethan said. Claire looked at the wall in front of her. "You said this room could be saved." "It can." "Then tell me what to do." Ethan studied her for a second. You sure about that? I run a company with 12,000 employees. That was not my question. Claire almost smiled. Tell me what to do, Ethan. He handed her a sanding block. Start with the window trim. For the next hour, the mansion heard something it had not heard in years. Work that was not being done for profit. Ethan repaired the damaged plaster while Claire sanded old paint from the trim. Dust settled on her hair. She complained about her shoulders. He told her she was holding the sanding block wrong. There is a wrong way to sand wood, she asked. There are about 14 wrong ways. Of course there are. When Sophie arrived after school, she stopped in the doorway and stared. You are working. Claire looked down at her dusty clothes. Apparently. Sophie grinned. Dad makes everybody work eventually. Ethan pointed toward her homework folder. Speaking of work. Sophie groaned and disappeared toward the kitchen. That evening, nobody went to the formal dining room. Margaret ordered pizza, and the four of them ate around the kitchen island while Ethan explained why old houses moved slightly with changes in temperature. Sophie argued that houses probably had feelings. Claire said corporations definitely did not. Margaret quietly replied, some corporations have more feelings than the people running them. Claire nearly choked on her water. Ethan laughed. Then Claire did too. The sound filled the kitchen with such unexpected warmth that Margaret stopped arranging plates and looked toward her. What? Claire asked. Margaret shook her head. Nothing, Miss Harrington. But her eyes had softened. Later, Sophie fell asleep on the living room sofa with a book open across her chest. Ethan carried a blanket over and tucked it around her shoulders. Claire stood nearby, watching the practiced tenderness in every small movement. You make it look easy, she said. Ethan lowered his voice. What? Being everything to someone. He looked at Sophie. It is not easy. You never seem afraid. Ethan gave a quiet laugh. I am afraid all the time. Claire looked surprised. Of what? Getting it wrong. Missing something she needs. Working too much. Not working enough. He paused. But being scared does not excuse being absent. Claire looked toward the dark windows. My father was always working. So am I. It was different. Her voice softened. He built the company because he wanted to give me everything. Ethan nodded. Maybe he thought everything meant security. Maybe. Kids usually mean something simpler. You are good at what you do, Richard said. Ethan kept working. Thank you. That was not entirely a compliment. Ethan looked up. Then you should probably work on your delivery. Richard's smile disappeared for half a second. Claire gets attached to projects. She always has. Then she moves on. Ethan closed one compartment of the toolbox. I am not a project. No. You are a contractor with a daughter who has started leaving crayons in a house that does not belong to her. Ethan went still. Richard lowered his voice. I am telling you this because somebody should. Sophie is getting comfortable. Claire is getting distracted. People like Claire live in a different world, Mr. Walker. Ethan met his eyes. People live in whatever world they choose. That sounds noble. Richard glanced toward the kitchen, where Sophie was laughing with Margaret. But your daughter is the one who pays when noble ideas meet reality. That landed differently. Ethan did not show it, but Richard saw enough to know he had found the right pressure point. You know how this ends, Richard continued. Claire returns to Boston. The board gets its sale. You finish the repairs and drive home. That is the arrangement. Ethan looked toward Sophie. Her red backpack was hanging from a chair beside Claire's coat. Two ordinary things, side by side, looking more permanent than either had any right to. You done? Ethan asked. Richard adjusted his cuff. Just trying to save everyone embarrassment. Then start with yourself. Ethan picked up his toolbox and walked away. He did not tell Claire about the conversation. That night, after Sophie fell asleep, he sat at his kitchen table at home with the Harrington contract in front of him. The house was quiet except for the refrigerator humming and rain beginning softly against the window. He studied the completion date. 6 days. Sophie appeared in the hallway wearing pajamas and rubbing one eye. Dad. Hey, kiddo. Go back to bed. She looked at the papers. Are we almost done at Claire's house? Ethan hesitated. Yeah. Then what happens? Such a small question. Such a heavy answer. Ethan forced a smile. We finish the job. Sophie frowned. And then we do not go there anymore. Ethan looked down at the contract. That is how jobs work. She stood quietly for a moment. I thought it was starting to feel like more than a job. Ethan's chest tightened, but his voice stayed calm. That is why we have to be careful. The next morning, he arrived at Harrington Estate earlier than usual. He worked faster. Spoke less. At 5 sharp, Claire found him loading tools into his truck. You are leaving without coffee, she asked. Long day. Ethan. He stopped. Claire studied him. Did I do something? He wanted to tell her everything. Richard. Sophie. The fear of letting his daughter believe in something that might disappear. Instead, he shook his head. No. Claire knew it was not true. Inside were copies of emails, altered valuation reports, and authorization documents showing that Richard had been pushing the estate sale through a private investment group tied to one of his own business partners. Claire had not been silent because she agreed with him. She had been waiting for him to finish talking. When the doors closed behind Ethan, Claire walked to the center of the room. Richard, she said. He turned, satisfied. Yes. Claire placed the folder on the table. Sit down. His smile faded. She opened the first document. You told the board this property had been independently valued at $12 million. No one moved. That is correct. Claire slid another page beside it. The independent valuation was $28 million. Richard's face changed. Claire continued calmly. You also failed to disclose that the purchasing group is managed by a company connected to your college roommate. The chairman reached for the documents. Richard began to speak, but Claire raised her hand. No. You have said enough tonight. Her voice never rose. It did not need to. One by one, board members began reading. The confidence drained from the room. Claire looked toward the rain-covered windows where Ethan's truck had disappeared into the darkness. Justice mattered. Truth mattered. But as the mansion settled into silence around her, Claire understood something else with painful clarity. She had spent years learning how to protect companies, contracts, and property. Tonight, she had protected all of them. And still, she had let the one person who had made this place feel like home walk out the door. The next morning, the rain was gone. Harrington Estate stood beneath a clear blue sky, its wet stone walls shining softly in the early light, and for the first time in weeks, the house was completely quiet. No board members. No lawyers. No Richard Caldwell. Just the faint ticking of the old clock in the foyer and the smell of fresh coffee drifting from the kitchen. Ethan arrived at 8:15 because one thing still remained in the workshop, his father's old toolbox, the smaller one he used for hand tools and kept beneath the drafting table during the restoration. He had no intention of staying longer than 5 minutes. Sophie waited in the truck with a book while he walked inside. Margaret opened the door before he knocked. Her expression softened when she saw him. She is in the workshop, she said. Ethan nodded. I am just here for my tools. Margaret stepped aside. Of course. He found Claire standing beside her father's drafting table, wearing a simple grey sweater and dark jeans. The restored room looked different now. The window trim had been repaired. The shelves were clean. Thomas Harrington's wooden ruler rested carefully beside a stack of old plans. Sunlight fell across the floor where rainwater had once spread through the room. Ethan stopped at the doorway. Morning. Claire turned. Morning. He walked to the table and picked up the toolbox. Looks good in here. Because of you. Because you decided to open the door. Claire looked down at the ruler. The board accepted Richard's resignation last night. The sale is off. Ethan gave a small nod. Good. That is all you are going to say. You handled it. I should have handled something else too. Ethan's hand tightened slightly around the toolbox handle. Claire stepped closer, but not too close. I should have stopped him before you walked out. Ethan looked at her. You had a reason. I had an excuse. Silence settled between them. Then Claire said, he was wrong about you. Ethan shook his head. This is not about Richard. I know. Her voice became quieter. That is what scares me. Ethan glanced toward the hallway. Sophie is waiting. He started toward the door. Ethan. He stopped. Claire took a breath. I hired you because this house needed repairs. He turned back. I know. No. I do not think I knew what needed repairing. Ethan said nothing. Claire looked around the workshop, then toward the open hallway beyond it. You brought noise into this place. You brought muddy shoes into the kitchen. You brought coffee cups onto furniture that costs more than your truck. Ethan smiled faintly. My truck is not that cheap. Claire almost laughed, but her eyes stayed serious. And Sophie left colored pencils everywhere. She does that. I know. Another quiet pause. And somehow, I stopped hating coming home. Ethan's expression changed. Claire continued before courage could leave her. I spent years thinking a home was something you owned. Something you protected. Something you could measure in square feet and market value. She looked at him. Then you and Sophie showed me it is something people choose. Ethan lowered the toolbox to the floor. Claire took one more breath. Stay. The word was barely louder than the clock in the hallway. Ethan did not answer immediately. Claire looked nervous for the first time since he had met her. Not as my contractor, she said. Not because I owe you anything. Just stay for breakfast. Stay long enough to let this be something real. Ethan looked toward the front windows, where Sophie was now standing beside the truck, watching through the glass. Claire followed his gaze. Sophie lifted one hand and waved. Ethan smiled. Breakfast, he asked. Claire nodded. Breakfast. A few minutes later, Sophie walked into the kitchen, looked at the 3 plates on the table, then quietly set her red backpack beside Claire's coat. Nobody said anything about it. They did not need to. Months later, the mansion still had expensive stone, old oak, and rooms large enough to impress almost anyone, but the kitchen had become the heart of the house. Sophie's drawings covered one corner of the refrigerator. Ethan's coffee cup had a permanent place beside the sink. Claire still ran meetings, still made difficult decisions, still carried responsibility with the same discipline she always had, but now she came home before dinner whenever she could. And sometimes, the greatest second chances do not arrive with grand speeches or perfect endings. Sometimes they begin with an open door, a quiet act of dignity, and one person finally asking another not to leave. If this story reminded you that kindness, respect, and quiet grace still matter, you can leave a like, share where you are watching from in the comments, and subscribe so more stories like this can find their way to you. Because houses can be repaired with wood and tools, but homes are built with trust, patience, and people who choose to stay.